So, Damian, welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Oh, I'm honestly like, I've already said to you before we did this, I'm so looking forward to listening all about what you've got to say. And I'm just, yeah, like I said, super excited to talk all about this. So, the first question that I ask absolutely everybody is, how do you refer to your disability?
It's a really strange one because when people ask me, like now, I'm a wheelchair user, and then
Yeah.
I wasn't until early last year. So I would kind of usually refer to myself as I have Ehlers Danlos Syndrome,
Mm-hmm.
and I have other conditions that go with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, if someone asks me, "Oh, what's going on?" I will be open and tell them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just class myself as disabled. It's a condition. I think that's how I kind of usually answer that one as well.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting, particularly with Ellen Dandridge, is that it affects everybody so differently.
Yeah,
Like, I think it was Clara told me that it's like you're referred to as zebras because when you hear the hoofs, everybody automatically thinks it's a horse, but
yeah,
actually it could also be a zebra.
yeah. And weirdly, I was diagnosed quite a long time ago. So before, like, it's wrong using the word fashionable, but it's one of them things you see a lot more now. When I,
Yeah.
I was diagnosed in 1994, basically it wasn't hardly known about then.
Yeah.
And I got seen by a geneticist. I was having loads of problems with dislocating my knees when I used to run when I was at
Yeah.
school, and that's what they diagnosed me with then. And I've had like that confirmed as time's gone on as well from other doctors. Um, it was literally no one knew what it was. Even
Yeah.
I would say into my mid-20s, if you ever said what it was, no one had heard of it. Even I would go to the hospital and doctors did not know what it was. It's still obviously it's one of them conditions that still has a lot to be like discovered. But I think there is more knowledge now, and I think the internet obviously has a place to play in that. There's more chat rooms and groups and things like that. But you still I can still go to a doctor and they still don't know about it. It's crazy.
It honestly it is because I know so many people who also have Ellen Dandridge, like way more than I ever thought I would know. And a friend of mine actually got diagnosed about 2 years ago, I'd say. And beforehand, before she got like a real diagnosis, they were like, "Oh, it's psychosomatic. Like you've gone through some trauma." And I remember her being like, "My shoulder's just popped out of place, and so has my knee, and so has my ankle, all within the space of like 2 days.
Yeah,
That isn't my trauma response. Something is going on in my body, so please can someone take a look at it?" And for so long that was what she was given, like, "Oh, it's a trauma response, it's trauma response." And it wasn't, because she now is diagnosed with Ellen Dandridge. And I think you're right in saying that a lot more people have a lot more knowledge about it
yeah,
because a lot more people are being diagnosed with it, whereas I think beforehand a lot of people thought it was psychosomatic.
yeah, yeah. And again, it's just I think if we can have more open conversations about why doctors don't believe people and things like that, and I think I've seen doctors who will say, "Oh, it's overdiagnosed," and people come in thinking that's what they have.
Mm-hmm.
But because there's no, especially for hypermobile EDS, there's no genetic test where others there is, and one
Yeah.
of the ones that I've got. But for HEDS there isn't. So there's so many arguments in the medical world about who has and who hasn't. So I think until these get sorted, it's going to be hard for a lot of people still to get diagnosed. And yeah, it shouldn't be like that.
No, it shouldn't be. But interesting that you got diagnosed quite like early on in your life.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, I haven't really spoken to many people who were diagnosed like so for like have had their diagnosis for such a long time. And what was that like for you growing up? Was it like beneficial? Was it not beneficial? Because you've had your diagnosis for like what, 27 years?
Yeah. Yeah, coming on that. Yeah, it gave me answers to what was going on,
Yeah.
but then it also uh made life quite difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So at the time I was, let's say, I was having a lot of dislocations with my knees, and problems with other joints. And the doctor's first thing was to put me on crutches. Now, that doesn't always work because my shoulders dislocate as well. At that time, it wasn't too bad. But I had a fall at school when I would have been 15, I think 14, 15. And school weren't happy with what had happened. So they kicked me out. They weren't willing to let me back on the premises in case it happened again, because we didn't have lifts at the school, because we're going back to the mid-90s. Accessibility wasn't really thought about then. So I had to go upstairs to most of my classes. And because I'd come down a couple of stairs, they were like, nah, we're not having it. So I ended up missing most of my last year at school. So I had the only way they could give me any teaching was to give me the council provided me a home tutor once a week who was a primary school teacher who didn't know how to teach GCSEs. So basically I had to self-teach myself some of the stuff. Came out with a couple of GCSEs and then had to go back to college to redo my last year, basically, because the school they were not helpful in the slightest. You wouldn't get away with it now. But yeah.
I know I'm sat here with my face open, and it's because I'm so genuinely shocked by that, because I always joke, and it's not really a joke because it's all completely based in truth, is that disabled children, particularly in school, are a health and safety nightmare for adults. And does that not just prove that point entirely?
Yeah.
And it was, it's wild that happened first off.
It was one of them things. There was just no way we could argue against it, because obviously it could have happened again, but the school just weren't even open to, for example, saying, come into the school, sit in a classroom downstairs, at least you're in that school environment. No, that was it. So obviously that had an effect on friendships and things like that. I'd already had issues with bullying beforehand, before that. So it really it made me then, as I got a bit older, once I came off the crutches and I was wearing braces a lot more and things like that, stuff that I could hide, I went through a phase for quite a long time of not telling anyone I was disabled.
Yeah,
I did it really well. So very few people knew.
And of course that is that would only be the natural response, because essentially you were singled out for being different, and not even just in a little way, in quite a big way. You were literally physically excluded.
Yeah.
Honestly, this is why we have these conversations, because I think people who are not disabled, they think, oh, the disabled community just chat and they scream and they shout and they're all really angry and all of this kind of stuff. And you hear stories like this and it makes you think, do you not understand as to why disabled people scream and shout so much?
Yeah. I think if it happened now, obviously, for example, my mum could have taken to the social media, there would have been an uproar, things would have probably been very different. Obviously back then that wasn't the sort of thing that happened. So it was just one of them things I had to get on with. And then let's say I went through college, university, kind of hiding my disability as much as I could. And then that obviously had an effect, because people were then wondering, days I was having bad health days, why I wasn't in lectures or anything like that. Yes, most of the lecturers knew and the university knew, but it was my peers that didn't know, because I just never felt comfortable telling people, because I didn't know how I was going to be judged. Was I going to be alienated again and things like that? So it had a profound effect, really, in some respects, right up until I would say my mid-20s.
Yeah, just unbelievable. And I'm so sorry that happened to you, because I can only imagine the repercussions that it would have had, because if it had happened to me, I would have been the exact same. And I don't know many people who wouldn't have been the exact same, because actually, and I recently had this, I kind of had a bit of a go at someone for this, but when you are called out for your disability, because it's something you can't change, you take it internally, because you can't change being disabled. So actually you can't, if you're going to try and exclude someone for that, well, no wonder you're going to internalize it, because I've done it in the past and been like, you know, how dare you? And then I'm just a really gobby person. So I'm like, fuck you. Like, that's not
Yeah.
okay.
I think like going through my late teens, the only time I wasn't say proud of my disability so much. It was like I was kind of willing to show it off was doing party tricks because well, obviously I can dislocate my joints. I'm very stretchy. I would do daft stuff, especially if I'd been drinking out with the mates. But I still people didn't understand it. I have friends that I've grown up with like for over like 30 years who still do not completely understand what is wrong with me. So, but I think talking now, like if I talk to people, I think it's different now being in a wheelchair. You see my disability. For a
Mm-hmm.
long time, you didn't see it. People didn't know unless they knew me really well, they didn't know there was something wrong. Like I would have to hold on to someone while I was out walking, for example, because I can't walk very far, or I would use a stick. But so many people would be like, "Well, I didn't realize there was anything wrong," because they just once, and then they've seen me go into a chair. They've kind of then they ask questions. But I also I've been very much for the last probably last decade more like outgoing where my disability is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
I like to be seen. I'm wearing bright clothes now. You'll see, like, and my like for most people laugh, but my wheelchair is bright pink.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna, if I have to use these things, I'd like them to be seen. My wrist splints and things like that, they're bright pink.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very different to how I was back then.
Yeah.
But hidden disability just causes such an issue, and people, I think, they don't see it because they can't see it. They don't understand it. They're not willing to listen. They're not willing to learn. They just think you kind of can be making it up. And I had that with school, like even teachers, like they were kind of, oh, is attention seeking or and things like that. It's just my school was horrendous, but yeah.
Honestly, like internalized ableism is such a thing.
Yeah. And I don't know if that is a generation thing, because like I say, going back to the like mid 90s,
Yeah.
very different to now. But obviously you still see it now. But I
Mhm.
look back then and it was probably like 100 times worse, especially around hidden disabilities and like neurodiversity and things like that. I
Yeah.
think there's more awareness where there wasn't then. But I still think you look back, you don't realize what effect that had on you till you're like an adult, and you can look back with an open mind and think, bloody hell, that's how I was affected.
Yeah. This is actually brilliant because it kind of ties into like my next questioning and because of that experience that you had at school and then having to retake a year of college and progressing from there, how did like your disability and that experience particularly, how did that impact the career choices that you went on to make?
So I I laugh because my career path is quite funny. So I left school, I redid my GCSE and did A levels. And then I decided to go to university. I was obsessed and still am with like real crime and things like that. So I did criminology as a degree.
Uh-huh.
Loved it. But then got towards the end of it and I was like, I've had enough of learning. What do I want to do as a career?
Yeah.
Um, because of my disability, I thought things like the police, prison service, it was always going to be an uphill battle. So I thought I
Mhm.
wouldn't mind doing social work. But when they said, "Oh, you'd have to do more learning and things like that," I was like, "Nah, I've had enough." So I came out of education and I worked for a football club as a commercial manager, getting them sponsors and things like that for about a year. And then I had issues with my health and I was in hospital for a while. And I thought, I need to find something else to do. So I set up an online store selling gifts and gadgets because that was kind of, as the internet was starting to progress in, I was like in my early 20s and there was more like online stores popping up. And I'd been doing that for about eight, 8 to 12 months, I would have thought, looking back. And then I went to a trade fair and I was walking around this trade fair and there was a stand selling, and everyone laughs with this, vibrating rubber ducks that were a sex toy, but because of this show, they could get away with it. And they're a brand called I Rub My Ducky. They're still in existence. They're an American company and they're a vibrating rubber duck. I usually have one on the shelf. I do have one on the shelf behind me, actually.
Oh my
This is
God.
the
That
Pride
is
version.
unreal.
And so obviously it's a very discreet vibrator. And when I was talking to the people on the stand and they were saying, oh, we have other stuff, but we can't show it on the main stand, which I'd like to come and have a look. And there was a load of vibrators and some other sex toys on the stand. I thought, that's brilliant. I wouldn't mind doing that.
Yeah.
And that was where my story into like the sex toy industry started. So I started a store then. So that would have been 2005, four
It's
or
super
five.
early doors, really, when it comes to
Yeah,
like
the
e-commerce.
yeah. And so I started doing that, and it became very apparent over the first 4 to 5 years trading was a lot of the sex toys weren't accessible
Hmm.
for people with dexterity issues, and I was always looking for something that could help people with disabilities.
Yeah.
So I then started concentrating on looking for products that were what I deemed accessible, and I spent a lot of time researching products, looking at them, getting them in, seeing how I like. A lot of people just think it's to do with the buttons, but for me, it isn't. It can be like the packaging, the instructions, the textures, the colors. There's a lot. You've got to look at so many, even the smells. There's a lot of people who don't like the smell of certain materials.
Yeah.
So I spent my time looking at things like that, and then the pandemic hit, and which was brilliant for business because everyone was staying at home. But I was
Everyone was bored and needed a
yeah,
vibrator.
exactly. And I was thinking, I'm getting a bit bored though,
Hmm.
which was weird. I was busy, but I needed, for what I had an itch that I needed to scratch. It was like there was something I needed to do. So I started some work with a UK charity called Enhance the UK, who do about sex and disability.
Hmm.
And then I decided to qualify as a sex educator as well.
Hmm.
And then with that, I've been doing work with sex education companies, but I've also then decided in one way, which is sad, I closed my store because I thought I want to explore more things. And I think working with bigger companies, I can have a bigger impact. So I now work with sex toy companies looking at how to make their products accessible and how we
Yeah.
can talk to more people in the disabled community. Because for me, sex and disability is a massive taboo.
Yeah.
I speak to so many people from the ages of 20 right up to 70 who have had no sex education, and that could be because sex education is crap in schools, in mainstream schools anyway. But it's even in a lot of SEN schools, it's just non-existent, or like they have to do some now, but until say 18 months ago, they could get away with teaching nothing. And I get so frustrated when I speak to someone, for example, in their 50s who is still very naive on a lot of sexual health topics. So I'm quite happy to talk to people, give them advice, tell them about products. So it can be anything from, what condoms are accessible, or even talking to people about going into a sexual health clinic, because these are not always accessible. You see videos
Yeah.
on Instagram, people trying to go for a smear test, for example, and they can't even get into the doctors. So we need to have these open conversations. So that's what I spend a lot of my time doing now.
What I love about what you've just said, because it's something that I would never have thought of, is about the accessibility of toys, and not just talking about the way that it moves, talking about packaging, talking about the instructions, talking about buttons, all that kind of stuff. Because actually, it rings so true. Because if you can't get into a product, then you would never buy it.
Yeah,
And talking about colors, and there is so much more about accessibility than people realize.
yeah,
And I think particularly in this market, because it's very much, well, like from my point of view, I would not say I'm a connoisseur in this market. This is something that I'm very much learning about from these kinds of conversations, is that actually it kind of sells very much like sex is very much one thing, and it tends to be between like a man and a woman, and that's it, and this is a toy that's going to help that. And by the way, when they tell you that it's between a man and a woman, these are both able-bodied,
yeah.
very attractive male and female. It's not like your average Joe Bloggs who drinks like a couple of pints a night down at the pub. Like, he is not in that advert.
No,
Like, he's not selling you a sex toy. But he might be the person that needs it and wants it.
yeah.
So it's fast, like accessibility, particularly in this area, is absolutely
And
fascinating.
representation's got a lot to do with it as well. Like,
Yeah.
you know, growing up, you'll be the same as me. You don't see anything on like mainstream TV, or there's little bits are starting to fall in now, but you don't like. For me, growing up, there was not much disability on TV, full stop. So now you're seeing little bits more, but in, for example, pornography and such, you don't really see disabled people.
Yeah.
The, only in a fetishized way, which obviously we don't want to see. So I think when you're talking to younger people and because they don't see someone who represents them, then it has another profound effect on their negativity, be it body image or self-loathing themselves. And one thing I talk about is I'm very big on pleasure-based sex education. Now it's very a lot of schools will not have it,
Yeah.
and I get why, but I think we need to start teaching people that pleasure can be achieved without just penetration. It's always about penetrative sexy sex education. So I think we need to start take it back and talk that pleasure for a lot of disabled people, the only way they can achieve pleasure is with sex toys, and people
Yeah.
forget that.
This is opening like a whole can of stuff that I've never thought about in my entire life. And I'm loving it, because I think it's so important to have these conversations, because as you say, like disability and sex is such a taboo. And the amount of people, and when I come to ask you this as well, I'm pretty sure you'll probably have a very similar response. But the amount of people that have said to me when I ask them, like, what's the weirdest thing someone's asked you? It is always, nearly always to do with sex. And it's always, can you have sex? And I think that comes from, and literally, as you just said, is that at school, you are taught that sex is penetration and that's it.
Yeah.
Because that's what we've been taught, or, very, very roughly gone over in some kind of like PHSE class, which was just awkward and weird, because often it was like a nurse that came in from like the local GP, and maybe she was like your friend's mum.
Yeah. So I'm going to just ask you one quick question, which is probably the wrong way to do it. But what was your sex education like? Because when I always ask people that.
I just remember being sat in biology class, and I remember being like, and I don't really know how we knew this, but we were all like, today's the day that we learn about condoms. And it was like, our biology teacher had this like green, and it wasn't even a dildo or like a symbol of a willy. Like, it was nothing. It was literally just like this, almost like cucumber, but it wasn't, and it wasn't as big as a cucumber either. And then she put on the condom, and I just remember being sat there being like, I feel so freaking awkward. And I think I was maybe 13, 14, and she wasn't a particularly engaging teacher. She was very much like old school headmistress, and it was actually just a really awkward experience for all of us. And it was a mixed group of boys and girls as well. It wasn't just like single sex. There was, boys and girls in this class, and all of us were kind of just like we thought this would be funny, but actually it's just a bit awkward, and we all just felt a bit weird. And I think also, I know what that sounds like, we were really young, we were like 13, 14, but actually like we knew about it already. Like we knew what they were. Like we didn't necessarily need to have someone show us how it worked. Like we knew how they worked. A few of us have been blowing them up with like making water balloons out of them for years. So
And
we knew what was going on, but it was just
because of the internet though, that has kind of transformed these conversations. People forget that like most kids are finding these things out on the internet before they get to that age where you're teaching them in class. So I think this is why we need to have these conversations about bringing it down. I know there's so many arguments about having conversations about consent with primary school children, but I think if you do it in the right way, it can only be a positive thing.
Yeah. And I think that's a really interesting one, because I don't actually think I ever had like a workshop or anything around consent. I've thought about this quite a lot. And only because, and the reason I've thought about it a lot is because I see a lot of videos, like particularly on like TikTok and Instagram, of like little children who are being taught that actually if they don't want to hug someone, they don't have to. And I'm like, oh my God, like how amazing would that have been to learn that at a much younger age than when actually you were maybe a teenager and you're like, oh, get off me. And in such a way that you have the language to be like, actually, like, you're invading my space, please get away from me. So I think actually you're probably quite right, is that actually consent workshops should be started way late, like way, way, way earlier than they are.
Yeah, and then like going back like to the disability side, I think if we have, you can put it into the consent category in a way. But if you talk to people and say like, if you've got someone who's neurodiverse, they may not react how you expect them to react. So if you can
Yeah.
talk about that, especially in schools where you could have mixed ability schools, which you do get, or even in SEN schools, I think because you might have someone who has a physical disability rather than a neurodiverse one,
Yeah.
you've got to explain how that can affect you. And if you don't do that, you grow up kind of misreading the room or
Yeah.
misjudging how someone's reacting to your conversation.
I am honestly loving this. I think it's so fascinating because something that actually just seems so simple when you talk about it, like, of course, why have these things not been spoken about? It isn't spoken about. And the fact that it's not is almost like I'm sat here and I'm like, oh my God, like education is a lie.
Yeah. Yeah. And like when I look at my situation, like with not being at school, I missed a lot of like what we call like social education lessons. So like
Yeah.
so that was what was taught in like your last year. But the sex education I had was literally the condom on a banana. That was it. Bit
Yeah.
of like in biology lessons, like but nothing else. And so you kind of grow up, and I was a really, which most people find funny. I was quite a shy teenager.
Yeah.
I wasn't the outgoing where I am a bit more now. But I kind of think back then, I look at myself and I think that was because no one taught me, for example, how my disability would affect my dating life, my sex
Yeah.
life, and things like that. Kind of I speak to so many, especially men, who have acquired a disability, be it a spinal cord injury or
Yeah.
something like that. Um, they don't know how that's going to affect their sex lives, and they don't always get that education from the hospitals or the doctors, and they kind of then left floundering. And I get emails from people asking me for advice and things like that, and I just find why aren't why aren't we looking at why this gap is happening? It shouldn't be
Yeah.
happening. But then you go back to I can't imagine now what it's like as a teenager if you acquire a disability, how that affect looking as you were getting older. I at 14, I maybe didn't think about it as much, but I look backwards now and think, yeah, that probably did have a massive effect on me because I was kind of, like I say, I hid my disability.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I remember having the conversation with my wife when we first met. Um, straight away I told her, and I was
Yeah.
like, right, I need to tell you, blah blah blah, and because obviously my condition's genetic as well. We had the conversations,
Yeah.
and then that went into a very long conversation that took a long, long time to decide whether to have children or not, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's so you've got to be open, but I think we need to have more education about being open about these things and how it might affect you.
I would wholeheartedly agree with absolutely everything you just said because disability isn't spoken about full stop in schools. And actually, it should be because when I think about my schooling experience and I didn't learn anything about disability. Like I learned nothing. So everything that I have learned about disability has come through my own lived experience, learning from other people online, and also reading. Now that is great. I'm someone who loves to learn. So for me to like find my own material, I find that quite fun. But actually, what about the kids or the people who don't have that? Where do they get their information from? Who do they turn to? And if, you know, social media has been incredible for disability because it's really highlighted a lot of awareness and gaps in like society and the marketplace where disability is completely left to the wayside. But where do you go if you need, like you said, like if you have a spinal cord injury and, a nurse is not necessarily going to be the one who's going to tell you how your sex life is now changed. So where do you go?
This is it, and this is one of the things I work on. I'm looking at ideas of where we can kind of change this conversation and talk to medical professionals and see if there's something we can do. But just picking up on something you've said there about kids learning, like and social media, really annoys me because there's such a negative still. Like there's so many positive disabled people on social media, but when you look at the comments and how negative it can be and the trolling and things like that. But I laugh because this morning kind of falls into both categories. I saw a conversation about Lego have released a new figure that has a limb missing.
Yeah.
They've only got upper arms, so they've got lower arms missing. And I saw people having a go about why had they done it. They're really negative about it and joking about it. And it's like, it's a great thing. If you can explain to children at a young age that not everyone looks the same.
Yeah.
And I think, especially with disability, because there's there's such a wide spectrum. So I think seeing something like that is such a positive thing. But then straight away, we're trolling, there's haters out there giving it full.
I honestly think had that Lego been around when I was like little, I would have bought everything to do with that that figure, because it's me. Like, I didn't have a hand, it's not going to grow back, and I'm not going to find it down the back of a sofa. So like a Lego doing that, I think, is incredible. And I'm completely with you, because I think a lot of people are like, oh my God, there's so many amazing things that happen. And then you get someone who's a good old keyboard warrior and they love being like, why are we doing this? It makes no sense. And you're like, actually, it does make sense. And like, I try and be nice. I really try and be nice, but like, I have a very, very low bullshit tolerance. So sometimes it's best for me not to comment, because I'll be like, here is an essay and an education. And if you can't understand the reason behind it, then maybe you need to go back to school.
Yeah, we've just become such a less tolerant society at times.
Yeah.
And like you say, if growing up, if you had more awareness of what was going on, like in the sense, like you say, if you saw a toy that looked like you, like for me, there was. Do you know what, I was just thinking, you've made me really think on this one, weirdly, because I was thinking there was nothing, me growing up as a kid, there was nothing that kind of showed disability. But like, I suppose the nearest thing to me would have been like a Stretch Armstrong or like an action figure where you could pull the arms out. I suppose that's about the nearest I'm going to get. So yeah.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I think there are so many brilliant things happening, but as you said, trolls do exist, and that is, and it's something that all disabled people have to work with, because there are a lot of people who seem to get very angry when disabled people speak the truth about how, like, the reality of being disabled, and a lot of people
I still get it, like, about people. I say what I do, like when I first started working in the sex toy industry and set up my store, a lot of people were so divided on it. I always say it would go one of two ways. If someone asked me what I did for a living and I told them, it would be either 100 questions, shut it down, or shut it down and walk away.
Yeah.
And it can still be like that. Some people, when I say now that I work as like a sex educator talking about disability, some people are like, oh, that's really interesting. And others, no, don't want to know, and walk away. It's
Whereas me, I'm like, all of the questions under the sun. Like, I want to know everything. But I think that what you're doing in terms of like how you want to educate people, I think that's so invaluable, because actually, when you look, and I'm thinking more about acquired disability right now, and particularly men. I don't really know why. I feel like women kind of figure things out a little bit better in this area. But like, there is such a taboo, particularly with disabled men, talking about sex, because actually every single guy who's been on this podcast has been asked, can you have sex? And where do they go to if they don't know the answer to that question? And like, what you're doing, like, isn't that amazing that you're providing something that actually a lot of people might be too scared to ask, or like they don't know where to turn to? Like, how amazing is that?
It's a funny one, because like, I have been asked the question, but only maybe once or twice. But my wife quite often gets asked it, like, more so.
Oh, right.
Like, yeah, and she would always get the question as well when I had the shop was, do you try all the products? I wouldn't get that. She would get that. So she would like laugh it off. And we would. So we're kind of used to them weird questions.
Yeah.
But I think one thing I always say is I'm not afraid to be open. I do have boundaries what I will and what I talk about, and and where I will and will say things. But I'm quite happy to talk about, how sex is one of them things, especially with a disability. When people ask me one bit of advice, I always say, be willing to laugh
Yeah.
and willing to listen. Like talk, listen, laugh. That's what I always say. And for me, like I quite often talk about it. As a younger person, my joints would dislocate. As well, they don't still now, but I've had dislocations during sex, and I've got to like, oh shit, put my joint back in, laugh it off,
Yeah.
and things like that. But if someone really wants to know, it does annoy me because, like you say, I think this is though because sex and disability is still a taboo. I think
Hmm.
people it's that voyeuristic
Yeah.
thing. They want to know that, like, because they can't see it, they kind of want to know what's going on. And like I say, when you see it, when there's rare occasions where it has been in porn and it's fetishized, it has that negative effect. So people are thinking, oh, it must be a bit kinky if they're having sex, or it must be a funky way of doing it, or something like that.
Yeah.
They don't see the normal way. One thing, one of my favorite sites is a site called Make Love Not Porn. It's run by this amazing woman called Cindy Galler, who I absolutely adore. And it's real world sex on there. So people can submit videos, and
Mhm.
there is actually some where there's a couple where the man is a wheelchair user. And so you see him getting out of his wheelchair and things like that. And it's so amazing to see,
Yeah.
but most people aren't seeing things like that. They're seeing the fetish, they see it, and then they build a picture up in their own head of
Mhm.
what maybe a disabled couple's sex life is like.
Honestly, like I'm sat here, my brain, you know that emoji where it's like the brain, like
Yeah.
that's like my brain right now because there are so many moments where I'm like, oh my God, that's so true. Like, that's particularly what you just said about disability being fetishized. Because as I'm going to caveat what I'm about to say, this is my personal experience. I'm a woman. I'm sure that men also go through this. But as a disabled woman, the amount of devotees that I have found on my accounts is alarming. And a very good friend of mine, Sandy, has literally just had an article published in the BBC all about this. And you're so right, is that it's hyper fetishized, and there's something kinky about it, or something like almost demonic, because some of the messages I've received, that honestly I could maybe have bought £1 million house for some of the people that want pictures, and it's nothing sexy. It's like, I want to see how your elbow moves. Pardon?
Yeah. I shouldn't laugh, but I'm just like, it doesn't surprise me at the same time.
Yeah.
I'm not shocked. And like you said, the whole devotee thing, it's again another thing people don't understand.
Yeah.
Um, a friend of mine did a documentary for the BBC about it
Yeah.
a few years ago, Emily Yates, and that's a fab program.
Yeah.
And I think again, but I do think that is more of a female thing.
Hmm.
I think and you do see it, and it's just wrong. But I take this back again to education. We
Yeah.
need we need to talk to young men about what they're doing wrong.
Hmm.
And I feel as a society we're getting it wrong in so many ways where sex education in young men is concerned. We vilify quite easily, and I think we need to educate and say, look, be it consent, especially around social media, sharing of images and things like that. But we need to teach them all about respect more, rather. And porn does have a role to play in the sense of
Yeah.
it's so. You look at porn now, and I just think it's getting too extreme at times now. Even like the mainstream sites that you would class as like where people go to, you it's having a really negative effect on young men.
Hmm.
Um, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle, sir. But I
Yeah.
think we just need to start talking about it more. And I think it's there's no quick fix for it. And I do think as well, I speak to people my age, and they don't get what I talk about because it's a generation thing. I talk like they'll see stuff on Pornhub, for example, and oh, that's amazing. But when you talk about it, then look at the negative context to it, they can't see it because we weren't taught that. So yeah, I grew up in a generation of lads mags like FHM and loaded things like that. And for all there was some really good stuff in that, I do think it had again a negative effect on how men look at women. So I
Yeah.
think we really need to change that.
Again, like loads of mind-blowing moments just then, because what I think what you said, like, it's so bang on. It's all so correct, and there's nothing in it that actually I'm like, maybe I'm like, no, 100%, absolutely. I'm like, I'll be your person, I'll back you up, I'll be the one that screams the rooftops as well. I think what you're doing, particularly around education and the way that you speak about education as well, like you're clearly so passionate about it, and I think that's wonderful, because I think so many people, and I know I always say this, but so many people benefit from hearing these conversations and not having them like in a space that's only for what you do. So this conversation is not just going to be in like the sex education space. And how important is that? Because someone out there might stumble across this and be like, this is exactly what I was looking for, but I didn't know where to find it. And I didn't want to go into that space because I'm not sure about it.
Yeah, because it's again, it can be a scary thing when you Google something. So you Google sex and disability, and there'll be some really good accounts come up. There'll be a lot of really crap ones as well. So you've
Yeah.
got to kind of filter it out. But if you don't know what you're exactly looking for, um, it I get frustrated quite often with articles about the best sex toys, for example, for disability, because it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
Because there's such a wide spectrum, like I say, a lot of people think, it's to do with the button size or how you hold it and things like that. It's more than that. And I also find I do product reviews, but I don't really often talk about how I think it worked on me, for example,
Uh-huh.
or my wife. I will talk about how I look at it, how it feels, and things like that, rather than say, well, because I get very frustrated with a lot of toy reviews because it'll say, this gives me the most amazing orgasm. What works for one person might not work for you.
Yeah.
So I think that's why I like to talk about how it works rather than what it does, like how it affects me.
Yeah. It's so true that you say that, because the reason that I ask everybody how they refer to their disability, and it comes into this like really, really well, is because everybody's experience of disability is individual. No, like you could have people with the exact same disability on paper, medical paper, but by the by, but you could have people with the exact same diagnosis, whatever, and the way that they refer to their disability and the way that they talk about their disability and the way that it impacts their life will be completely different. And I'm not saying there aren't things that will be in common. Of course, there will be, but it's so individual and it's so down to that individual person. And I think you also are having that, you're having these conversations as
And
well.
I think it has a massive effect on how that person can is looked at with the people around them as well. I think
Yeah.
how you kind of I would say like the last 10 years, I've certainly changed my outlook where my disability is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And I would talk about it a lot more. Even when I was doing bits around disability and sex toys, I kind of was still apprehensive about how much I talked about my own disability.
Yeah.
Now I'm quite open to talk about it if anyone asks. And it's funny because you see so many people on social media saying, they get sick of being asked. I very rarely get asked in some respects, even though I'm in a bright pink wheelchair. I always have, I'd say 99%, I have bright pink trainers on because that was always the thing. I always wore bright pink trainers, and when I was told I needed to use a wheelchair,
Uh-huh.
I was like, I want a bright pink one. And I was sat in the hospital. They said, right, let's sort your wheelchair out. What
Yeah.
color do you want? I said, bright pink. They didn't believe me. They were like, no, 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 you don't. You'll want a different color. I said, no, I'd like a bright pink wheelchair, please.
Yeah.
And when the day I went and picked it up, they were like, we really did not believe you. We thought you were going to change your mind when you came. I was like,
Yeah.
no, 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 it has to be bright pink. And people now know a lot for see me either wearing bright pink, either the pink trainers or the pink wheelchair.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel that most people accept me for that. But
Yeah.
there is still people who think, well, what, you know. or they'll judge me for it. They'll make a figure in their head. They'll think I'm maybe gay or
Yeah.
and things like that. But
It is. It's fascinating, isn't it? I like to think that through any form of hardship that we go through, that if at the time you can think about one positive attribute about yourself or learn, something about yourself that's positive, it don't want to say it's been worth it, but at the same time, like, you've learned something and you've grown from it. And I was just wondering, through any hardship that you've had, is there a particular positive attribute about yourself that actually, in hindsight, you're very proud of?
one thing as I've always been proud of, this like all my time, is I'm willing to listen. I love listening to other people's problems and giving feedback and things like that.
Yeah.
I just and but otherwise, I think it's just willing to learn now. I love listening to people's experiences of disability, and I want to kind of take that and manifest it into something better, which is what I love what you're doing. I think we need to have more people giving these stories and kind of switching off from the crap that is out there.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. That does mean a lot, because sometimes I think I'm just talking to myself and I'm like, yay, go Brooke.
I love doing it because I've co-hosted a podcast before, and I'm in the process of going to be launching my own soon. And because I love talking, most people know it's always quite often a joke. You can't have a 10-minute meeting with me. It will be at least an hour.
Yeah.
Um, and that's just the northerner in me. I think I love to chat. I like to listen. But I think there's too much where we kind of shut off now. I think we we're quite, as a society, I think we've become cut off in the sense of, because there's so much on the internet, you see people's stories, but I think you look at how like people are turning away from Instagram and things like that because they don't want to learn anymore. They don't want to listen. They just kind of they want specific things in their face, not willing to listen, like to look at the background, for example.
Very, very true. And I think what I always find really interesting is when people are like, Instagram is your echo chamber. And I'm like, so you're not always going to learn from it because it's what you're interested in, and it's the things that like come up in your feed, or the things that you interact with. And I always find it so interesting because I think, imagine if it wasn't an echo chamber and you actually used it to learn, and you
Yeah,
used it to learn about different things that maybe weren't necessarily to do with you, just for learning processes. Because I think, every day is a school day and you can learn something new absolutely every day. But if you learn something, and then because you learned something new, you were then able to understand someone else better, or someone else's culture better, or, disability better. Is that not like the best use of technology?
yeah, and I think again, I often say to people like when they want to know questions about disability, if they're not disabled themselves, I've always said, don't be afraid to ask, but just give it a little bit of a thought before you ask, that you're not going to offend. And I'm not easily offended, so I'm quite happy for people to ask. They want to ask what my condition is.
Mm.
As long as they get me in the right frame of mind, and I'm not having a bad day. I'll tell them. I have days where my head's up my ass and I don't really want to talk about it, but I'm quite happy to talk about it. But I think it's it's got to be done in the right place. Just someone stopping me in the street and asking me, I'd be like, it's not really any of your business. But it's got to be done in the right context.
Yeah, for sure. I was wondering, do you have a piece of advice for a younger version of yourself, and also a younger person with the same disability as you? Now, they don't need to be the same pieces of advice. They could be two completely separate pieces of advice. And just, is
I
there
think
anything that comes to mind?
I think it would be not to be afraid to show it.
Yeah.
I was afraid to show my disability, and younger me should not have been like that. Should have been all out, just go for it. And I think that, yeah, I think don't be afraid to be yourself. I think your disability is part. I always say no. My disability is part of me, obviously. And I'm not afraid to show it. And
Yeah.
I think that is what we've got to be. Is we shouldn't be hidden away.
Yeah.
And I speak to people all around the world talking about sex education and things like that. And it frightens me when you talk to some of these countries and I'll say, oh, do you ever hear anything about sex and disability? And they'll turn around and say, one, no, until you don't really see disabled people. So it's like we need to do more as a global society. We need to bring these barriers down, and just be yourself.
Oh, I love that, because I think that's such an important piece of advice for like anyone disabled or non-disabled, is actually like just be yourself, because you're going to be way more exhausted not being yourself than
And
if
my other one is just be willing to laugh at yourself.
yeah.
I'd say this, and like I'm quite open. I have had issues with mental health and things like that. But even when I'm being in my darkest patches, I still have to try and find ways to laugh about myself and my situation.
Yeah, I think we're probably quite similar, because I do my best work when I'm laughing or when I'm having a good time. So much so that I have the words "it's all about having fun" tattooed across my body, because that's when I do my best work, is when I'm having fun. And I think that's a great one. Like, just be able to laugh. Like,
Yeah,
even if
it's
you can find like the smallest thing in the world, like, it might be like an old picture of someone. For example, the reason I bring that up is because I have she's gonna kill me. I have a picture of my auntie when she was a child on my phone, and it's maybe the funniest picture I've ever seen in my entire life. Like, there's nothing particularly special about it, but every time I see it, it brings me to tears. I'm in that much laughter. And I think if you can find, your version of your picture of your auntie,
yeah.
keep it close by, because it's amazing what it
So the
can do.
one my go-to when I need something and I'm at my lowest is watching. I think it's about the first 3 or 4 minutes of the Minions movie, the first one, because that
Really?
just makes me chuckle. And that is like I have that on one of my screens if I am like in a really low mood. Like music is my go-to, and but like that is the one thing.
Yeah.
But it's
Well,
I think it's having that bucket attitude as well at times.
yeah, you do. I think you're like absolutely correct. Sometimes you do just have to kick the fuck it bucket and like
Yeah,
crack on.
yeah.
So I love asking this question. And because of your job, I'm so sure you've had multiple of these. But what are some of the weirdest questions that you have ever been asked?
Oh. Now, probably the weirdest one in a way is because obviously I'm really flexible. Is can I give myself a blowjob?
Did you have your ribs removed? Like,
I can't well, I'm saying that I used to be able to get my legs around my head quite easily. I've not done it for a long time because I realized how much pain it used to put me in. But
I
yeah,
so wondered where that was going then. I was like, oh my God, is this going to be a secret admission?
no, 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 not tried, not willing to. But I still get asked it now. I have friends who
Yeah.
ask me, "Have you ever tried?" And I'm like, "No,
No.
not happening."
Oh, that is a first. That is a first. Like, I would honestly, I think for a day, when girls and guys are like, oh, I'd love to be the opposite sex for a day just to see what it's like. I would like to be an able-bodied person for the day. I would love it. I would just love to see how they like see disability, because of it, like, it's my reality. Like, I don't know any different. So like for me, I get really confused when people don't understand disability, because obviously like it's my lived reality.
Yeah,
I would love to spend a day in an able body or like a non-disabled body, just to see what the world was like around me, and like, and maybe understand some of these thought processes where people think that it's acceptable to ask these questions, because it blows my mind every time.
it yeah, it's and I think the other one I used to get quite often was about my joints coming out. Did my joints ever come out during sex?
Yeah.
Obviously, as I've said before, yes, they do. But yeah, they're the probably two weirdest ones I get.
Oh, honestly, like it's absolutely wild, isn't it? Like, oh, it's funny as well, because I think if you don't laugh at these questions, I think if you actually thought about them and took them
Yeah,
to heart, you'd probably cry and be like,
yeah,
why do you want to know that information about me? Because it's nothing to do with you.
yeah, and it's how people like kind of judge you. Like it's I've had like been told, numerous times, oh, you shouldn't have children because your conditions genetic and that. And my wife and I have chosen not to have children. That was one of the reasons. But for me, it's no fucker else's business. It was mine and my wife's choice, no one else's. And it's a hard conversation to have. So you don't want to listen to the crap that comes with it from other people at times.
Yeah, completely. And like, God, I've loved this conversation today. I feel like I've learned loads. I actually genuinely learned
I
so
feel
much.
it could go on for a lot longer. That is the thing.
Oh, honestly, it could probably go on for like another 2 hours, and I'd be like, "Tell me more!" Like, I'm so intrigued. Like, how do you source these things?
Yeah. It's just one of them things. It's because we don't talk about it enough.
Yeah,
People then want to know more, and I think because we don't talk about it, that is why it's a taboo.
yeah,
So hopefully, having more conversations like this, the work I do, the work other people doing, talking about sex and disability, it can make it less provocative and then not causing rows and things like that. I think we just need to be open about it. And I get parents of disabled children asking me about how they should have these conversations, and it's like you just got to be open about it. Don't hide the fact that if a teenager gets to 14, they're wanting to ask things about sex and they've seen things on the internet, especially now because of the internet. Have the conversation. Don't shy away from it. And I do think it's a generation thing of parenting as well. Like, yeah.
Honestly, even what you've just said then about parents of disabled children, like, would not that it's not crossed my mind, but like it's not always at the forefront. And I think for me, I think I would love to get it to a state, or like, the work that you do, where we don't see disability in sex and immediately think fetish. Because I think for a lot of people, that's immediately what they think of, who are not necessarily in the disabled community. That is their first port of call. Because for so long, and this goes into like a whole societal thing, disabled people were left on the back burner, or we were seen as other two, different, and that kind of plays into that fetishized role. And when porn first went on the internet, I'm sure that's why it went there. And I think wouldn't it be wonderful if we could get to a place where we didn't see immediately like disability in sex being a taboo and disability in sex not being fetishized as the first port of call.
But that's why the media, in the sense, has such a lot to do. Like, for example, Love Island over the last couple of seasons, they've made this issue of they've had disabled contestants on, but they've never been really like visual in some respects. And until you see someone in there with either a limb missing or in a wheelchair, I don't think you're ever going to see that. But then again, that person who's willing to do that is going to know they are going to get a lot of abuse in that, because it's going to take time to break that taboo down. So it's going to take people who are willing to go and put themselves in the firing line to break it down.
Yeah, and it's so true. I've only got one final question for you, and like, I feel like if I don't stop it now, we're going to go on for like ever, because I think there's so much to be said. We're going to have to do a part 2. I'm going to call it now. There will be a
happy to do a part 2.
Because there's I've so many like questions in my brain. But my final question for today is, Damian, can you say that you're disabled and proud?
Yes, I certainly can.
Oh, amazing. Well, I have honestly learned so much today. I've had so many moments, like so many aha moments, and so many things that I'm probably going to mull over now for a couple of days. And I just really want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to come on the podcast and have this conversation with me, because I've absolutely loved it.
Anytime. I've absolutely loved it. It's been a joy.
Brilliant. Oh, thank you so much for being a guest, and we'll speak soon.
Talk soon. Bye.